Please take your seats as the program is about to begin. Please take your seats as the program is about to begin.
American journalist Evan Gershkovich is right now in Russian custody.
The U.S. State Department formally declared Evan Gershkovich, quote, wrongfully detained.
Americans should be deeply concerned about what's happening.
100 days in Russian captivity.
This was the cover of the Wall Street Journal today.
There's no evidence for the charges.
His colleagues at the Journal are promoting the hashtag #IStandWithEvan across social media.
Nothing that might even be taken as a sign of dissent is allowed in Russia right now.
Well, it was obviously very disturbing to see Evan in a glass cage just for doing his job, just for reporting.
Evan is an all-American boy.
Happy birthday to you.
Very, very curious from early age.
He always had questions about everything.
It's kind of born to be a reporter.
I know that he felt like it was his duty to report.
We condemn the detention of Mr. Gershkovich in the strongest terms.
Evan went to report in Russia to shed light on the darkness.
Evan's incarceration is an assault on free press.
Evan was doing what reporters do.
We have missed his reporting and authoritative insights into Russia at such a crucial time.
Evan is innocent.
If this can happen to my brother, it can happen to any journalist.
Our message to Evan is this: keep the faith. We won't stop until you are home.
I rely on President Biden's promise to do whatever it takes to bring Evan back.
Please welcome to the stage Dana Perino, co-anchor of America's Newsroom, co-host of The Five on Fox News Channel, and former White House press secretary.
Thank you. Good morning.
It's an honor to be here on behalf of all of my colleagues, and you're going to hear a lot more during the panel discussion. I was White House press secretary to President George W. Bush, and we had a couple of situations like Evans that were dealt with during that time, and there's so much that is even happening in the news in the last 24 hours that we will be able to talk about today. Thank you for being here. Our founders put the First Amendment there for a reason. It's first because it is so critical, and freedom of the press is something I hold dear, and I know that all of you are here today because you have that commitment as well. To kick things off, before we get to the panel, I would love to bring to the podium Jeannie Bourgault. She's president and CEO of Internews. Jeannie? Oh, there she is, on my right.
Good morning, everyone. I am Jeannie Bourgault and president of Internews. We're an international nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting independent news organizations currently working in about 120 countries around the world. And we work in a lot of challenging places, including places like Ukraine, where President Zelensky famously said at the Russians' full-scale invasion, "I need ammunition, not a ride." Well, our Ukrainian journalist partners there would have had similar sentiments at the time. Theirs would have gone more like, "We need flak jackets, not security training." So you can imagine my pride when Oksana Romanyuk, one of the leaders of the Ukrainian media sector, told us Internews was the first organization to bring to journalists in occupied Kherson the flak jackets and security equipment they needed to continue reporting. This is after the city fell to Russian hands. Ukrainian media outlets were being shut down, their journalists kidnapped and killed. The flak jackets helped them ensure that the true story of occupied Kherson was told. But for every success, there are many darker moments. We answer many pleas, as many pleas as possible, but the scale of attacks against the media, particularly local media, continues to grow. We at Internews are privileged to have a global operational reach and 40 years of experience, so we have a lifeline of help that we can provide to journalists virtually anywhere, but we need the flexible financial resources to be able to do so at speed and at scale when crisis strikes. And that's why I'm so pleased to be here today to launch our commitment at the Clinton Global Initiative. We're committing to raise a $10 million Internews Risk and Response Fund, a permanent unrestricted fund designed to protect the lives and livelihoods of local journalists all around the world, to ideally keep their news organizations operating through a crisis and ensure that we're there to provide that help. We've already raised $3 million towards this goal, and I'm here today to ask anyone who really believes in the importance of independent media to join us with this commitment. With the funds already raised, we've been able to provide support during crisis. We provided the flak jackets in Ukraine. We have helped Afghan journalists relocate after the Taliban took over. More recently, we've been supporting radio stations in Chad, providing life-saving humanitarian information for people fleeing the crisis in Sudan. People everywhere need trustworthy information. We are immensely grateful to the Clinton Global Initiative for standing with us to support the truth and those who report it. Thank you.
It's an ambitious and wonderful commitment that they are launching today. Great to have her. I'm going to introduce our panel, and they're going to come on up, and we're just going to get right to it. There's not going to be long intros, so you're going to get all the information you need in this hour. Jody Ginsburg is the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Almar Latour is the CEO and publisher of Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal. And Jason Rezaian, he's an opinion columnist of the Washington Post. Let's welcome them here. Okay, good morning to you as well. Thank you so much for being here. The Wall Street Journal wrote, "The imprisonment of journal reporter Evan Gershkovich is a reminder of the fight we are in." And Almar, as you are well aware, we are approaching the 6-month mark. And a couple of questions for you. Before we talk about Evan, how he is now, I wondered from your perspective, what was it like when you first got that call that Evan had been taken?
Well, thank you, first of all, for being here and supporting this very important topic. So going back there, No publisher, no editor wants to receive that call. I happen to be, at the time, just coming back from a visit to Robben Island, contemplating Nelson Mandela's political captivity there. And a call came in, and the head of security and the head of HR were on the phone, and I could hear in their voice that something was off. At that point, Evan just went missing. He had not shown up. The protocol was broken. So we were filled with hope. Everybody stayed calm. We deal with these situations, unfortunately, a lot, and that's why we have these protocols. The next morning, the FSB released a news release sharing the news, and that was a shock. We had feared the worst, and that came true. You want to have, in that early stage, some space to maneuver and some space to actually contemplate what your next steps are going to be, and to have that foisted upon us on the global stage added to the shock. We then very quickly put in place what I would call a business unit dedicated to Evan's release. Any normal business unit is part of it. The general counsel, outside lawyers, we retained lawyers in Russia, obviously, corp comms, and perhaps most importantly, a grassroots effort immediately started, almost instantly, driven from the newsroom, people who've worked closely with him out of London, but also from many other places around the world. And that took hold, and we're still in that pattern today, where the grassroots effort and the support that all of you give every day, that is so important to keep this a priority, and that's been the whole game for us.
He was quite beloved. He is quite beloved by his colleagues. I knew that right away. Even we work in the same building, and you could feel it immediately. And there's a big picture of him, and keeping his name in the news, front of mind every day. That's a commitment that you've made, and of course we all do. And everybody in this room, I'm sure, thinks about him every day. Do you know? Or can you give us an update on how he is doing? We know that we have somebody here who has had experience with this, and we want to hear from that. But from Evan's perspective, and does he have access to information? Do you really think he knows the support he has?
I think he has an impression of the level of support. There is correspondence from friends and from acquaintances and from strangers to him. He can write back as well. How is he doing? Resilient is what we believe. Ambassador Tracy in Moscow met with him on Friday and believed he was doing well. We have to rely on secondhand information. Often the information that we get is through his Russian lawyers or through his own correspondence with us. His parents got to see him, got a glimpse of him in Moscow before they went back, and as they left the country, the Russians revoked their visas to come back in, an act of cruelty on top of cruelty. And so there's a hearing going on right now. Actually, it may have ended, but Evan was, again, in a glass cage. He looked sort of similar to the images that sadly we've gotten used to. He smiled a little bit, but it's awful to see your colleague or any human, any journalist, just for doing their job, caged like an animal there.
One more question to you. For everybody to understand, what have the Russians said what are they accusing him of, and how do you respond to that?
Well, there's a suspicion of him engaging in spying. But there's a pre-trial hearing and pre-trial process going on in Russia right now, and so official accusations and the official charges have yet to be lodged, and that's what some of the hearings also are about. Today's hearing is an appeal for us for his pre-trial detention. The expectation is that his pre-trial detention will continue. So how do you respond to that? Well, the wrong thing to do is, I think, to not respond. You might want to let something like that wash over you, but absolutely not. Evan was there doing his job. We're loud about it. He's absolutely doing the right thing. A very important task as the whole world is in turmoil to find out what's going on in one of the hotspots in the world.
Jason, I have read your work for years and admire you from afar, and it's so good to meet you in person. And if you don't follow him already, please do so, because it's incredible information. And you're one of the few journalists that has firsthand experience. And it was from 2014 to 2016. It was in Iran. And I know that perhaps your captivity was different than what Evan is experiencing now. I'm not for sure, but perhaps take us back a little bit about your moment of being arrested.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you to the Clinton Global Initiative for hosting a really important conversation. Thank you all for being here today. Look, I think when my wife and I were arrested from our home in Tehran back in July of 2014, it was at a moment when the US and Iran were engaged in very high-level negotiations over the future of Iran's nuclear program. There was a lot of hope about a potential opening. We don't have that same kind of hope with Russia right now. So I think when we were first arrested, a lot of people felt that this wouldn't last very long. It ended up taking 1.5 years. And we learned a lot in that process about how authoritarian regimes use their judicial systems to abuse individual citizens, in this case journalists. It's very similar, actually, to what is being done to Evan right now.
And what did they say you were arrested for?
Spying. And in a lot of these states, charges of espionage, other charges against national security are used to really suspend your due process, suspend your very basic right to representation. And in the background, an entire system is being mobilized against you. In our case, it was the Iranian parliament, the judiciary, the law enforcement, security services, the executive branch, state media, very similar to what's being done to Evan right now. So I think we are growing a body of evidence of cases like this in Iran, in Russia, in China. And for that reason, when I first heard the news of Evan's arrest, I sort of reached out to people I knew at the Journal and said, hey, look, we can be competitive about anything you want. Can't be competitive about this. And I'm not even asking permission from my bosses at the Post, but I'm here for you however you need. And the Post, I think, probably within minutes or maybe even before I had made those calls, had already been in touch with Almer and others at the Journal.
Were you and your wife held together? What were the conditions like, and what sort of access to information did you have?
So we were arrested and taken to Evin prison, a very notorious prison in Tehran, where political prisoners are held. We were in the wing that is under the control of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. We were put into solitary confinement immediately, separated, in cells that were about 4.5 by 8.5 feet, lights on 24 hours a day. I had no knowledge of her whereabouts for the first 35 days. I was kept in solitary confinement for 49 days. She was kept in solitary confinement for 72 days. And then she was released on house arrest. I was kept in Evin prison for the next 500 or so days, put on a sham trial, very similar to what Evan is experiencing right now. And my access to information was extremely limited. I didn't obviously have newspapers or the internet to look at. 1.5 years later, when I first came out, I didn't even know how to turn on an iPhone anymore, right? It's very, almost like a caveman.
It's fascinating. We'll get more of that in a little bit. Let's get Jody in here. There seems to be increasingly aggressive behavior against journalists in certain regimes around the world, both journalists who are maybe from the United States who are covering those regimes, or even the journalists in those countries. And from your perspective on the Committee to Protect Journalists, how do you help address that threat, or how do you see it, I guess, from a bigger picture? Am I correct that it feels like it's worse?
Yes, it's worse, and it's not just worse in authoritarian regimes. It's worse everywhere. The threats to journalists have increased exponentially. I've been a journalist for 2 decades, and I've never seen anything like this. We have record numbers of journalists in prison. Last year, the Committee to Protect Journalists documented 363 journalists in jail. That's the highest number in the 30 years that we've been recording this. And in part, that's because authoritarian and other regimes have recognized it's a pretty effective way to shut journalists up. You don't need to kill them, you don't need to physically threaten them, you just bring legal proceedings against them that can go on and tie them up in expensive, complicated legislation for years and years. It may be, unfortunately, another year potentially till Evan even comes to trial. In the meantime, all of his reporting ceases, and it sends a very powerful message to other journalists for them to also stop reporting. So what happens when you arrest a journalist is frequently others will then start to self-censor because they don't want to face the same fate. So we see journalists arrested on these trumped-up charges, for example, of espionage. That's quite a frequent charge. National security threats, as we see in Hong Kong in the case of Jimmy Lai, a journalist who's in prison there. But also charges that are ostensibly not related to journalism. So increasingly we see governments using spurious other charges like financial crimes, as we saw against Nobel laureate Maria Ressa in the Philippines, or we're seeing in Guatemala in the case of Jose Ruben Zamora. So that kind of muddies the waters. It sort of reinforces this message that we hear a lot from leaders, that journalist equals criminal. And if you see a journalist put in prison for a tax evasion or a national security, you start to think, well, maybe there's something in that. So that's happening increasingly. We're also seeing, of course, increased online harassment of journalists, particularly female journalists, and often that tone is set from the top. Again, in the Philippines, accusations of journalists being prostitutes was the term that was used, and that filters down into the general discourse. So increasingly, journalists, those from marginalized communities, face a huge onslaught of online harassment that occasionally, unfortunately, spills into offline physical violence. We see journalists threatened at protests and rallies, physically assaulted, and again, not just in authoritarian regimes, but also in countries like the US and the UK. So the environment for journalists has become extremely febrile, and it means that we at the Committee to Protect Journalists are increasingly having to protect journalists in all sorts of places where perhaps we wouldn't have done before, provide security training, digital security training, physical security training here in the United States, in Europe, as well as trauma support. I mean, we were talking about this earlier, but the consequences of being held in solitary confinement for a long period of time or facing relentless online harassment, that has an effect on an individual's psyche. And so being there to be able to provide trauma support and psychological support is increasingly important as well.
I asked her a question that she says is very complicated to answer and would take too long, but I'm going to ask her to maybe just give it a quick stab, because one of the things that you have now is that phones, for example, are ubiquitous. You have them everywhere, in third world countries indeed. And so you have citizen journalists, and I'm curious how the committee addresses any calls from somebody who maybe isn't employed by the Wall Street Journal, but will call and say, I need help.
So we at the Committee to Protect Journalists tend to define journalist in a slightly more narrow way, so either someone that is working for a recognized outlet or engaged regularly in the act of journalism, in other words, documenting news and facts in order to publish that or in order to broadcast that. That said, I think it is really important that we recognize anyone engaged in the documentation of facts and of trying to get out the truth is deserving of protection. Free expression deserves our protection and our defense. And increasingly what we see is in places like Iran, in places like Russia, anyone, whether they be a journalist or a citizen, engaged in trying to disseminate facts and information that the authorities deem unacceptable ends up in jail, in exile, and all of those people are deserving of our defense and our support.
Jason, it's not the exact same, but there was news this morning. If you've already read Jason, as I have, you'll see that he did an interview with the Biden administration official Brett McGurk at the National Security Council about the prisoner swap yesterday. They're not journalists, but I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that news and about the decision that has been controversial about the $6 billion, which is apparently for humanitarian aid, and it's the South Koreans, and it has to go through the Qataris. But basically, if you're average Joe out there, you're like, wow, they just got $6 billion for that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we can debate or question the numbers in any one of these cases, whether it's in exchange for financial remuneration or prisoner held in U.S. prison, as in Brittany Griner's case and others. But ultimately, what I've come to understand, and most of my reporting in the last few years since I've come home, has been on these two very interconnected and personal issues, right? The attacks on journalists and also the hostage taking by foreign governments of Americans and citizens of other democracies. And what I've learned is that, in the absence of really credible deterrence tools, which we do not have as the United States of America or our allies in Europe, countries have every incentive to do this because there's nothing standing in their way, right? So I think the question should be, not whether or not it was the right thing to do or worth it, but it should be, what are we doing to make this costlier for regimes like Iran, like Russia, like China to do this again? And when it comes to journalists, as Jody was talking about earlier, it's a kind of a two-pronged attack, right? There is this desire to use us as citizens to leverage us against the United States, but also to silence journalism in those countries. The effect of my arrest in Iran 9 years ago now has been the dwindling of independent news coverage from Iran, and then by extension, the silencing of Iranian domestic media. And many of those journalists who've been arrested in Iran are now fleeing Iran to third countries. So we're going to be dealing with a tidal wave of exiled journalists. We already see them landing on our shores. Dozens, if not hundreds of them, have emigrated to the United States over the last couple of years. And we have to prioritize getting those folks up and running as journalists in the free world. But ultimately, on the question of what do we do about these cases and was it the right thing to do, I think any president's always going to have to decide that the right thing to do is whatever we need to save our fellow citizen from being held hostage in a foreign state. Because if we don't, and right now there are several dozen Americans being held hostage by foreign governments, if it becomes several hundred, what is the US government going to do to protect us? And I don't really want to have to make that rhetorical question a very direct question, because I think the answer is quite clear that we don't have the resources to handle hundreds, if not thousands of cases. And if it gets to that point, none of us will feel comfortable traveling around the world.
And the Biden administration made a point yesterday to stress over and over. I think they heard it in the president's statement. I read it in McGurk's comments in your column this morning, which is, the answer is, do not go to Iran.
Look, I went to Iran. I'm a dual national, born in the United States of America. My father was Iranian, so by virtue of my father's citizenship, I was an Iranian citizen. I traveled there for many years. I worked there as a journalist for many years with full permission of the government. And, I was under the impression that, by following the rules of being a journalist there and getting the accreditation, I would be safe, similar to Evan and others in Russia. That's changed. That's changed dramatically, and I think folks in the press freedom community look back at my arrest as sort of the first in a long series, and the same goes with Iran in general. Don't go.
And there's danger in that too, right? For the world, national security. And Almar, the economics of journalism is making it increasingly difficult to send. And even when I was press secretary, there were foreign bureaus. AP had a foreign bureau, the Wall Street, there were places all around the world, and a lot of those have closed. Some of that has been economic. How do you at the Journal think about that, and Dow Jones overall, or your colleagues in the industry think about the importance of trying to get people there to report, because without eyes and ears on the ground, nobody knows anything?
Well, first off, you're right. There has been a deterioration of a presence outside the U.S. of the U.S. press corps. You've seen a sharp diminishing. Some of that has been economic. The Wall Street Journal and a couple of other news organizations are blessed to have the resources to be out there, but that's being complicated in other ways. The cost of not being there, however, is that at a time when the contours of a new era are being drawn, right? And there's so many changes happening all around us that we don't have the right information in the West or around the world to arrive at the right decisions when navigating very, very complex issues, be it in technology, geopolitics, climate, et cetera. And so the cost of not being there is extremely high. For us, that means that even as we are confronted with a situation with Evan right now, we have a deep commitment to remaining present around the world. Obviously, that's been greatly complicated, but we can still, with that determination, extract major news, even if the presence on the ground is not as big as before. This morning, we had a big scoop on China, for example, even though our presence in China has decreased rather significantly. How does that happen? Well, you're still sourced. The world is interconnected. And so even as you face that pressure, even as you face diminishing numbers abroad, you have to stay committed to that story.
Jason, you want to follow?
Yeah, and I want to put it to all of you as we think about this issue. There's incredible resources and help going on for journalists, but just to reiterate, I mean, there are incredible journalists from these countries that are now out in the free world. We have to come up with ways to get them involved in how we deliver the news on the countries where we don't have windows into anymore because our presences have been eliminated or diminished. There's an expiration date on how long someone has a real grasp on what's going on in their home society. We should use that and leverage it so that we can maintain insight into the large swaths of the world that are kind of going dark in terms of media coverage.
Elmar, just quickly, and maybe you can't say anything, but assuming that you have the cooperation you're looking for with the administration, there was a story recently about Putin suggesting he wanted this one bad actor that has been imprisoned in Germany for a swap with Evan. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if you can even comment about that, but is there anything that you can say about that, what we're doing as the United States to try to get Evan back?
Yeah, I can't comment on very specific actions or attempts, but I can say that the Journal did a big piece on this particular individual, and so it's worth reading, in part because it highlights the cost of these trades. There's a monetary cost, as Jason just highlighted, or a huge moral cost, all right? And so, but that aside, we've been working very closely with the Biden administration. They have made it a priority very publicly to talk about this. There are many competing priorities. And so for us, there's only one metric that says that we've done enough, and that is the day that Evan walks out of that prison and comes home. And so until such time, it's very important for us to keep that collaboration going, look at all the alternatives, support where we can, but also keep the pressure up and make sure that this is a priority for society at large, because the issues are so big. It's Evan. It's a highly personal situation for him, for his family, for his colleagues. But there's also this massive underlying issue of freedom of press. Without freedom of press, no free society.
Jody, when you said earlier that one of the things that some of these governments will do is to spread terrible rumors, especially about female journalists, it really struck me, and it's not something that's really been on my radar. And I wonder what the committee has done, and maybe people here in this room could help amplify the efforts to provide journalists either moral support or tactics and ways for them to protect themselves from this kind of harassment.
Well, moral support is essential. I think whether you're being harassed or you're in jail, we know that first and foremost, what makes a difference to people is to know that they are supported and have support. So coming out vocally in support of, in defense of people is really important. And to stress their work and why the work is important. There are tactics and techniques you can use to minimize your exposure online. There are tactics and techniques that you can use to identify bad actors and try to have them removed from platforms. But I think most importantly, what we can do is to remind people why journalism is important. And I think, and I say this as a journalist, I think sometimes we don't do a good enough job explaining to people why the work we do matters. And it matters because that information is important not in a big, grand, global scale. It matters to us on an individual level. We've just come out of a huge global pandemic. It was important to know what you should do in order to keep yourself safe and your family safe. It was important to know where you could go, where you were allowed to go. It's important to know what your local school board is doing for your families. It's important to know what the weather is going to be like, so you know whether you can safely take a plane or you can safely travel. All of these things matter, and they matter to our individual lives and our ability to live freely and safely. And I think stressing that and stressing why it matters and what you lose when you don't have those stories, the stories that get lost when a journalist is murdered for carrying out an investigation into corruption between a government and a business, for example. And to keep telling those stories, I think, is really, really essential.
There was a story last weekend that caught my eye, and I'm blanking on her name. She's an award-winning journalist. She was recently banned from India to go on her own honeymoon. Did any of you see this? So she's a journalist who is getting married, and her honeymoon is going to be in India. And 4 days before she's to leave for her trip, she finds out her visa's canceled. And the reason is because when she filled out the form, and she said what her profession was, she said journalist.
And that's fairly common. So we find increasingly, in India in particular, journalists are often banned from traveling out of India. That was the case with the journalist, for example, Rana Ayub, who writes for the Washington Post. It is a frequent method for, again, punishing and restraining journalists to prevent them from traveling, to prevent them from communicating and meeting with colleagues. And unfortunately, it is yet another tactic and a tool in the armor to prevent journalists from doing their work. And it's really important, as we start to think about what we can do differently, is to have governments, those in the public eye, speak out publicly when we see those things happening, because we don't want to be in a situation, as Jason said, where in years to come we can't do anything because essentially governments have realized that they can take these actions against journalists and no one will do anything, so that everybody is fair game. So it's really important that people take action now to speak out when they see journalists being targeted, but also to defend and support journalists when they come to a place like the United States and are exiled here for their journalism, so they can continue to do their work from the US, from the UK, from elsewhere.
It's also just low-grade harassment as part of that autocratic playbook, right? So just, not allowing somebody to go on a honeymoon in a country, it sends a signal that then is amplified that, if I go to India, now in the back of my head, maybe journalism is more complicated than I thought. And so it's an active policy of discouragement, and you see that all over the world.
I find it quite alarming, and perhaps I should not be surprised. I'm rarely surprised. I can be shocked, but not surprised, right? But India, is it getting worse? I mean, President Biden was just there.
India, I'm sorry, Jody, but it has become one of the worst places in the world to be a journalist. I think the number of journalists who've been killed in suspicious cases, I won't call it murder because that's a legal term, and most of these killings have not been prosecuted, right? Dozens in recent years.
And we brought it up ahead of the Modi visit here a few months ago, that it needed to be stressed, that you can't have the head of the world's largest democracy come to the US, which trumpets the First Amendment, and not say anything about the restrictions to freedom of the press. And that's what I mean when I said at the front, these things are not simply happening in authoritarian regimes, and we're sleepwalking into a situation in which we're potentially allowing journalism to be increasingly strangled so that none of this information that's vital for all of us will get out. And it's why it's really important that we see the Biden administration and others speak out publicly when they see even friends not defending press in the way that they should. And that includes also being able to critique it when those threats are happening here too.
Indeed. One of the things that we've done is paint a pretty dire picture of the situation. We have about 5.5 minutes before we're going to take questions from the audience. And I wonder, Jason, if you wanted to talk about sort of the good news. I'll give one. I mean, I think that the amount of content out there and good quality content is overwhelming. I don't know how to use my TV anymore at home. My husband was out of town last week, and there's 4 different remotes. And I work in TV. I cannot turn on the TV. So last week, from 7 to 9 before I went to bed, I just listened to podcasts. I listened to the new Lex Fridman podcast with Walter Isaacson for an hour and a half, talk about his work and the new book that he's just written about Elon Musk. The content is really quite impressive.
I think, there is so much content out there, but the ability to produce really incredible journalism, the resources that we have, the tools that we have now, are so far beyond what was available just a few years ago. And so I think that's one more reason why we can use those resources, use those tools to empower more and more journalists, right? The digital forensics work that the Washington Post, the Times, journals doing to really use open source video and images to recreate atrocities that are happening or have happened in other parts of the world. This is really essential work that we couldn't do just a couple of years ago. So yes, there is a lot of things to be excited and happy about, but also, with the advancement of AI, we also have to be concerned about that.
Oh yeah. Are we doing a panel on that? Maybe we should. Maybe just one last word before we take questions about the positive things that you see happening in journalism now.
Well, so many. I will name 2. So one is that the marriage between journalism and data is just unlocking the type of reporting that was simply impossible a few years ago. So you can go so in depth at such a scale that we haven't seen before. Second, demand for quality news is very, very strong. If you look at the fear index, with every peak, we see a massive influx of new subscribers, people wanting to know. And so there is a hunger for people to understand the world.
That's great. One quick word on positivity.
So I think we talk a lot about how people no longer value journalism, but actually I was really heartened. I don't know if you were aware of the story of police effectively overreaching in Marion County in the US, where this tiny little newspaper that had like 2,000 followers had a warrant, and they came in and took all of the computers and everything. Anyway, the anger that people felt about that overreach resulted in them effectively doubling their subscription. So now they have more subscribers than there are people in the town, and I think that's rather lovely.
Yeah, it is. All right, we are open to some questions for the panelists. If anyone wants to raise your hand, we have microphones, I believe, that can come around. And if you don't raise your hand, I will call on you. Oh, here we go. There she is. Oh, here's one here, and then we'll come over here to you. Yes, sir?
Hi. Good morning to everybody. I'm former ambassador of Serbia to the United States, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about the role of U.S. government can play. But you mentioned the example of India and President Biden being there. You know, Europe is also at the forefront of lack of freedom in journalism. You know, we know the examples of Hungary, and Serbia is one that I follow closely. What can be done to pressure more U.S. government and State Department to kind of condition their relationship they have with some of these countries that are pressuring free press and journalists? Is there a way to lobby more and to influence State Department to be more involved in terms of their relationship with some of these governments? Thank you.
Jason?
Yeah. So I think for a long time, it's a really important question. The U.S. government was sort of the leader in this space. A statement from the Secretary of State or a phone call from the president to a leader of another country to release a journalist who was in prison did the job. We're no longer the main player in this space. It's these other bad regimes like Russia, like Iran, like China that are really leading the way. So I think we have to kind of return to this as a core value of what the United States of America is all about. This is not a partisan issue. We have to stand firm that, you know, any arrest of journalists, any suppression of expression, wherever it is in the world, especially if it's being done by one of our close allies, isn't something that we're going to tolerate. But that has to be in more than in word. There has to be, you know, consequences that follow it. And I'd be eager to see if the Biden administration is willing to take on that task.
And we have time for just a quick word from both of you on that, and then we'll get you to your next speaker, which I think you're here to see.
Just putting the spotlight on the cost of not acting, of not speaking out, I think is important. That's something that we in news media actually can control ourselves. And so making sure that it's a national priority, that this is being taken seriously as a major topic.
I think better engagement of diplomatic networks, and we are seeing that through things like the Media Freedom Coalition, but also pointedly connecting the relationship between a free media and trade and investment. I think we can see increasing conversations about that because it's incredibly difficult and challenging to invest effectively in a country that you know nothing about. And so linking those two things together, I think, we'll start to see improvements.
I love that point, and I'm going to think more about that. Let's give a big round of applause for our panelists and for Evan Gershkovich, Jason, Almar, and Jody. Thank you so much. And a few years of our organization was somebody that you are here to see, the amazing Secretary Hillary Clinton. Here she is.
Thanks so much, Dana, and thanks to all of you. I caught the last part of that powerful conversation, and I want to thank all the panelists. You know, this whole issue of protecting and promoting a free press in the United States and around the world is critical to all of us, to our democracy, to our sense of security and freedom. And your insights and experience make it clear that the ongoing assaults on journalists around the world has to be elevated to the urgency that it requires. I know we're here in part because of the unlawful, inexcusable imprisonment of Evan Gershkovich, but it is something that precedes him, something that's happening around the world with so many other journalists. And we have to do more to not only help free Evan, but to protect and speak out on behalf of the countless journalists who we may not even know their names, who are on the front lines of trying to give us the information that we need. Many of them are actually local or citizen journalists covering crucial issues that range from the Arab Spring to the Black Lives Movement to the anti-regime protests in Iran. But we have to remember that the citizen journalists in the time of ubiquitous cell phones are also bringing important stories to light, and they're increasingly under threat and face imprisonment, exile, even death. I saw a lot of that as Secretary of State. I saw and worked on behalf of journalists and other Americans who had been harassed, intimidated, imprisoned, even killed. But I was always impressed by how it did not seem to daunt, intimidate, or stop their efforts to work, write, and speak about what they were seeing. Now, we are talking about Evan, and we think very clearly about Russia, Iran, China, but of the 67 journalists killed in 2022, more than half were murdered in Latin America and the Caribbean. More even than were killed in active combat zones in Ukraine. And we don't cover that. We hardly even know it happens. Occasionally we'll hear about a cartel who murders a journalist in Mexico. But otherwise, these killings largely go unnoticed and unreported. These journalists were targeted for covering crime, corruption, behaviors that catalyze climate change, deforestation, illegal mining. And it's often not the governments. It's not like the FSB picking up Evan in Russia. It is corporations. It is cartels. It is other non-state actors who are also targeting journalists. So we have, if you will, a kind of double-headed monster of both state actors who are suppressing journalists and suppressing their reporting, and we have non-state actors who are doing the very same. And here in the United States, I don't need to tell you, but we also are living with attacks on journalists on practically a daily basis, denying things that happen not only before the journalists' eyes, but our own eyes, creating alternative facts to support false narratives. And we have a very real war on truth, facts, and reason. So I think all of us have not only a responsibility, but a clear duty to defend free and honest journalism, to help keep all of us informed, to hold institutions to account. It's not unfair, but obviously it's an old axiom that you can't have a democracy if you don't have people reporting on what leaders are doing. And so we need to defend journalists, not only in autocracies like Russia, and not only against non-state actors in Latin America, but we have to be vigilant in the United States as well. I want to thank you for the commitments to action that are being made in this really important area, particularly Internews with its $10 million commitment for a risk and response fund. In my own experience, it is often really difficult to know how to evaluate the risk and how to respond. So the more effort we can put into that to try to understand better what will actually help protect journalists, get them out of prison, literally save their lives. I've been in situations where journalists have asked me to mention their name in Africa, Latin America, in official meetings, because they feel like if somebody who's Secretary of State or even earlier Senator and First Lady mentions their names, that gives them an aura of protection. So I want to underscore the last points that were made by the panel. I think the United States has still the leading role in defending the press and journalists. And it is sometimes not done in public because that would only endanger the journalist. Sometimes is done in private. Sometimes it has to be made public. Sometimes you have no choice. But we need a constant effort, almost a team that is evaluating the risk and figuring out how to respond. You know, when I was Secretary of State, we created a fund to help the LGBT community activists who were often in danger, again, particularly in Africa, but not solely in Africa, because that's that became one of Putin's early culture, warrior moves. And so we put a fund together to try to get people out of countries, to try to get them out of prison, to try to protect them as best we could. And I think we're going to need something like that in the government as well. And so this Risk and Response Fund, I hope, can work hand in hand with the Biden administration to try to figure out how best to do that, along with the Committee to Protect Journalists, which has been on the front lines for so many years. So I think that the vigilance that's required, the creativity, the new solutions, creating new tools perhaps, is something that we all need to give serious thought to. And we also have to have a better way of helping to evacuate journalists in very difficult and often conflict situations. We had that experience coming out of Afghanistan, where a lot of us who were working to evacuate people were very conscious of trying to cooperate any way we could to get journalists out. It's obviously true in real war zones, but it's also true in these places where non-state actors pose the biggest threat. So remain vigilant, do everything we can to protect and promote free speech in general, but in particular, that which is conveyed by journalists, including citizen journalists, and then do everything we can to liberate detained journalists and move others out of the way of death and imprisonment, get journalists like Evan home. So it's important to me that we held this session because I don't think that we are raising this issue to the level of visibility and urgency it needs, but I'm very conscious of how that sometimes makes situations more difficult. So it's that delicate, delicate line to walk. So Dana, are you, am I wrapping up? I think I'm wrapping up, okay. But thank you for coming to CGI. This is an ongoing effort to try to bring people together to actually have reasonable conversations about what we can do to solve problems, difficult problems, challenging problems here in our country and around the world. And we're thrilled to have all of you here for this important session. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for joining. Please make your way to the main stage session in the Grand Ballroom.